And I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today we'll be doing our grade 7 English lesson on inappropriate shifts in verb tense. So we'll be doing our grade 3 English lesson on inappropriate shifts in verb tenses. And remember, when it comes to tenses, right, then we usually either, then it means it's something to do with either in the past tense, in the present tense, or in the future tense, right? So if we're talking about inappropriate shifts, then it's either how you are using a specific tense inappropriately or you're using it incorrectly, if that is the word. And before we start, we are going to log into aplusstudents.ca. Once we've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 7, and then scroll down up until we get to the chapter of inappropriate shifts in verb tense. So we said our chapter is inappropriate shifts in verb tense. Our subject is English language arts, grade 7. And the lessons that we're going to be focusing on under the chapter of inappropriate shifts in verb tense is to identify and correct inappropriate shifts in verb tense. And we are doing our tutorial lesson on aplusstudents.ca, right? So that is where we're going to be doing our, let's say basically our tutorial lesson as well as our test. All right, so when it comes to different tenses, right? Remember we said tenses usually means it's either in the past, in the present, or in the future, right? Verb is basically the action, so which means that it's the action either in the past, present, or in the future. So the tense of a verb, right, which is the action. So the tense of a verb, it tells you when the action takes place, right? And we say when the action takes place, it's either in the past, in the present, or in the future. So do not do not shift tenses within or between sentences unless you need to reflect a time change, right? So sometimes what we do is we add a certain, let's say a certain word, but then the tense is incorrectly. And that is what they mean when they say do not shift tenses within or between sentences unless you need to reflect a time change, right? So if we look at an example, it says Kathy grew up in Cleveland, but now she lives in Pittsburgh, right? So she grew up in Cleveland, but now she lives in Pittsburgh, right? So that is basically how we are, it's almost like we are time changing, right? Because Kathy grew up, it's almost like showing, especially if you look at the verb, she grew, it shows the grew is the word that is in the past tense, right? It's a verb within the past. And it basically shows that she grew up in Cleveland. It's almost like showing the past. But now it's saying, but now she lives in Cleveland, right? Which means that this sentence over here gives us an indication that it is present, right? So this is like a time change from the past, and this is present. So here they're even saying that the sentence, it shifts to present tense to reflect a time change, right? So the time changes based on, she first mentions the past, right? And then the sentence, then it shifts to a present tense, and it's basically her reflecting a time change. So that is the only time where you do a time change, right? Like your sentence literally needs to show that it is a time change. But your wording, let's say either your tenses or your specific words that you're using, that cannot but you cannot use certain words, let's say the words incorrectly, the specific tenses incorrectly, because then it means that you are shifting, um, you're shifting in time, but you're not actually reflecting really on a time change. All right. If we look at the next sentence, it says Rachel grabbed the microphone and speaks to the crowd. All right. So Rachel grabbed the microphone and speaks to the crowd. So if we want to show a time change, right? Sometimes you don't even have to do a time change, because the specific wording that you use in the specific tense will either just be used in will just be used correctly, right? And then we don't even have to do any form of time change, right? Or we don't have to reflect a time change. If we look at this one, it says Rachel grabbed the microphone. So grabbed shows the verb tense, and this is basically in the past. It shows basically the past. So grab or grabbed, because we just added an ed to show the tense, which is in the past. Here they're giving us two verbs, right? It says and speaks to the crowd. And speaks to the crowd, or do we say and spoke to the crowd? Here they're saying that Rachel grabbed the microphone, right? So if she grabbed it in the past, right, then we can maybe just say that we can remove the word speaks, and then we can just say and she spoke to the crowd, because this shows in the past. So if this shows in the past, then we don't even have to reflect a time change, because then it shows that a whole sentence is basically in one tense, and that is basically in the past. So both of these sentences are basically in the same tense, which is in the past tense. So grabbed being in the past tense, and she spoke to the crowd being in the past tense. So once again, inappropriate shifts in verb tenses, it's where you're using specific it's like we're using the specific tenses incorrectly, right? So now within a sentence, or like you'll have two different tenses, that is used incorrectly without even doing or reflecting on a time change. If you do reflect a time change, then it is totally understandable to do that. But if you're doing it without even realizing because the wording that you're using is just incorrectly, then basically that sentence is incorrect. So basically, it says the tense of a verb, it tells when the action takes place. Do not shift tenses within or between sentences unless you need to reflect a time change. Kathy grew up in Cleveland. So basically, do not shift tenses within or between sentences unless you need to reflect a time change, right? Which means that sometimes your specific sentence will be written in a manner in which you are reflecting on a time change, right? Then that is appropriately used. But if you, like I say, if you are using it with the wording that is used incorrectly, your tense, your, let's say your verbs are used incorrectly with the different tenses, then it is being called an inappropriate shift in verb tenses. Because if we look at the first example that we did about Kathy growing up in Cleveland, right? It says Kathy grew up in Cleveland, right? So which means that the first part of that sentence is in the past. But now she lives in Pittsburgh, right? So based on the specific sentence, the oval sentence, right? Here has been a time change, and a time change has or let's say there's been a reflect on a time change based on how the sentence is being formulated, because here they specifically says Kathy grew up in Cleveland, but now, right now, shows the present tense. Remember we said present tense shows whatever that is happening now, but now she lives in Pittsburgh. And that basically it shows the tense, right? And they're actually showing the shift in the present tense to reflect a time change. So time change from the past tense to the present tense. And then we have Rachel grabbed the microphone and spoke to the crowd. And I specifically remove speaks to the crowd, right? Because there's basically no shift changed, right? So both of the words, right, should basically be the same tense. Both of them are in the past tense because Rachel grabbed the microphone, which is in the past, right? And then she spoke to the crowd, which is in the past. So which means that we do not have to reflect a time change at all. So both of the verbs are basically in the same tense, which is in the past tense, which means that spoke as well as grabbed, these two verbs, it shows the verb tenses within the present tense, within the past tense, sorry. All right, so we said that we are doing our tutorial lesson on A plus students.ca. So now let's go to A plus students.ca. All right. I think yeah, you'll be able to see the words more in bold, right? Basically the what we just spoke about, where we say that the tense of a verb, it tells you when the action takes place. Do not shift tenses within or between sentences unless you need to reflect a time change, right? And we specifically showed that over here we had a time change, which was the sentence of Kathy that grew up, right? All right. So we specifically said that yeah, a time shift or time change happened because of it's almost like the formatting of the sentence or the way the sentence was written, right? So it basically started in the past and then it basically continued to someone doing something now, which is in the present. And then here we said Rachel grabbed the microphone and spoke to the crowd, right? And we specifically remove speaks because there's no time shift, right? We don't have to reflect on a time change at all. So, which means that both of these words, which is Rachel grabbed the microphone as well as and spoke to the crowd, right? This shows the same tense, which is in the past. So it shows the tense, which is in the past. Okay, so now the first activity it says, does the following text have an inappropriate shift in verb tenses? If so, then we need to fix any verbs that don't match the tense of the verb in bold. And if not, then you just submit the text without making any changes, which means that the sentence will then stay the same. So it says, while members of the Lycaenidae family of butterflies range in color from blue to red to orange, all members have a reflective iridescence sheen to their wings, right? It means that they basically have it now, right? So which means that if we look at the specific sentence, right, instead of us saying the all the members had a reflective iridescence sheen to their wings, we need to then just change the word to they have, right? All right, let's look at the next one. It says, does the following text have an appropriate shift in the verb tense? If so, fix any verb that don't match the tense of the verb in bold. If not, submit the text without making any changes. It says, although a ballet dancer's pointy shoes appear dainty and delicate, their rigid tips, right? Their rigid tips, we can say, provide incredible support, allowing dancers to balance on the tips of their toes, right? Which means that this is actually telling us that it is in the present tense. So instead of us saying they, it says, although a ballet dancer's pointy shoes appear dainty and delicate, their rigid tips. Instead of saying it provided, the tips provided incredible support, allowing dancers to balance on the tips of the toes, right? Provided shows past tense. So it shows the tense in the past. But if you want to show the tense in the present, right? Because ballet dancers basically still use the same pointy shoes, right? Which means that it is still being provided, right? So we can basically say they are delicate and their rigid tips it provides. So we just say the tips provide incredible support, allowing dancers to balance on the tips of their toes. So provide is our answer. So which means that we do not have to show an appropriate shift. So we remove the word provided, right, which is in the past tense. So does the following text have an appropriate shift in the verb tense? If so, then you fix any verb that don't match the tense of the verb in bold. If not, submit the text without making any changes. It says the bakers run a dairy farm. So the bakers run a dairy farm. So before we even continue, this word run, the word run is in the present tense, right? The word run is in the present tense. So the bakers, they run a dairy farm, which means that they are still doing it now. And they produce a soft, creamy goat cheese or chèvre from the goat milk, which means that we are going to say produce, which is in the present tense also. And the reason why we're specifically saying produce in the present tense, because if we have to say produced, and then it means that there will be an inappropriate shift because produced is in the past. So which means that we use the word produce because this word specifically tells us also that it is in the present tense. All right. So that is basically how we can see if we are using something inappropriately or if we need to reflect on a time change or not, right? But sometimes a specific word, especially the first part of the well, let's say the first verb of the first part of your sentence will tell you already what type of sentence it will be within a specific tense, right? Like in this case, we look specifically at the word run, which tells us that it is or indicates that it is in the present tense, which means that we then change if it was written in the past tense, we then change that word to the present tense. All right, let's do some more. All right. We're going to say, does the following text have an inappropriate shift in a verb tense? If so, fix any verbs that don't match the tense of the verb in bold. Or if not, we're just going to submit the text without making any changes, right? All right. In 1989, thousands of students in the People's Republic of China called for democratic reforms. So even if, let me, before I even continue, let me underline this word called, because this word called is in the past tense, right? Okay, so in 1989, thousands of students in the People's Republic of China called for the democratic reforms. And, right, if this is in the past, right, then it means that we are also going to, our tense is also going to be in the past, right? So which means that instead of, we need to choose between, are we going to say, and they gather or they gathered, right? So we need to choose one of this in order to show that our inappropriate text is correctly, right? So it says that in 1989, thousands of students in the People's Republic of China called, which is in the past tense, for democratic reforms and, right? So if that is in the past, then we say and gathered, because it's something that they did in the past. Gathered in Tiananmen Square to protest the communist government's policy, right? This word gather is in the present tense. So the gather is in the present tense, right? So which means that if we specifically leave that word, let's say gather within that sentence, and then it means that we are going to be doing an inappropriate shift. because this sentence does not need to reflect a time change at all, right? So which means that we are not going to be using gather, right? But we're going to be using gathered because gathered is in the past tense. So which means that they called democratic reforms and gathered in Tiananmen Square to protest the communist government's policies. All right. Let's go to the next one. All right. So here it says, does the following text have an inappropriate shift in verb tense? If so, fix any verbs that don't match the tense of the verb in bold. If not, submit the text without making any changes. The mayors run a dairy farm, right? So before we even continue, if we look at the word run, run is in the present tense, right? So run is in the present tense. So the mayors, they ran a dairy farm, and we can then say they produce because it is in the present tense, and produce a soft, creamy goat cheese or chevre from the goat milk, right? So we use the word produce because it basically shows the the verb tense, which is in the present. So which means that there is no time or no need for a time change or to reflect on a time change, which means that we just stick to the word which is produce to show that it is in the present tense. All right. So basically, it is just us having to um, write the correct word or the correct verb within its specific tense, right? Because sometimes when it comes to the reflect changing, we think that it's the reflect change, but it's not. It's just that our word, we are using the an inappropriate word, or let's say the incorrect wording within that specific sentence. So now it brings about a time change based on the specific verb that you have written down. So although most people usually associate penguins with Antarctica, many penguins actually many penguins actually live along the coasts of Africa, Australia, and South America. So if we look at the word associate, if we look at the word associate, associate, it's in the present tense, right? So associate is in the present tense, and they say although most people usually associate penguins with Antarctica, many penguins actually live. So then we say the word live, which is also present tense, along the coast of Africa, Australia, and South America. So we don't say lived. If you're going to say it's lived, then lived is in the past, right? And this is basically going to be an inappropriate shift in verb tense, right? So that is an inappropriate shift in verb tense. But if we just use the word live along the coast of Africa, Australia, and South America, and then it is correct, right? Because our whole sentence is basically the present tense form, or in the present tense form, right? All right, let's go to our test where we're going to identify and correct inappropriate shifts in verb tenses. So, does the following text have an inappropriate shift in a verb tense? If so, fix any verbs that don't match the tense of the verb in bold, and if not, then submit the text without making any changes. All right, so here it is. Blake poured. I'm going to put this word in bold. Blake poured the freshly made popcorn into a deep plastic bowl and, do we say, and sprinkles or sprinkled some salt on top before claiming his spot on the couch. So if we look at that word poured, right? He poured. Then poured, it basically shows it is in the past tense, right? So Blake poured the freshly made popcorn into a deep plastic bowl. So poured is in the past tense, which means that we will then say, and he then sprinkled some salt on top before claiming his spot on the couch. Because now it is basically showing the past tense form. So Blake poured the freshly made popcorn into a deep plastic bowl and sprinkled, because sprinkled is in the past, some salt on top before claiming his spot on the couch. And the word sprinkled in the past tense is correct. In the early 1900s, Frank Epperson's popularized, right, the popsicle after he, do we say, after he patents his idea for the frozen snack, or after he patented his idea for the frozen snack. Popularized, is that in the present tense or in the past tense? Popularized. So popularized, right? It shows the past tense. So it shows the past tense, and it says, in the early 1900s, Frank Epperson popularized the popsicle after he patented his idea for the frozen snack. Patented, which matches the past tense. Alexander Fleming presented his findings on penicillin, the first antibiotics, in 1929. Unfortunately, his discovery raises little interest at the time, or raised little interest at the time. I'm going to read it again. It says Alexander Fleming presented. We look at the word presented, right? Presented is in the past, right? So it's in the past. It says he presented his findings on penicillin, the first antibiotic, in 1929. Unfortunately, his discovery raises or raised little interest at the time. And if we were to choose the correct one, do we say raises concern or little interest, or do we say raised little interest at the time? Especially since presented is in the past tense. All right, so if we choose the correct one, right, it says Alexander Fleming presented, which is in the past, his findings on penicillin in the first antibiotic in 1929. Unfortunately, his discovery raised, let's say raised, little interest at the time. So even if we look at the wording, right, it basically takes us back to the past, right? So we will go with the word raised. And raised is correctly because raised is in the past tense. In 1989, right, thousands of students in the People's Republic of China called for democratic reforms and, do we say gathered, or they gather in Tiananmen Square to protest the communist government's policies. So we need to choose either gathered or gather. So in 1989, thousands of students in the republics or in the People's Republic of China called, look at the word called, right? Called gives us the indication that it's in the past. So called for democratic reforms and Tiananmen Square to protest the communist government's policy. So if we use the word called, right? Called is in the past, which means that if we look at a specific answer, right? Do we say that the democratic reforms, do we say, and they gathered, or do we say they gather? Oopsie. All right, so if we choose the correct one, we will say, and gathered. And gathered is correctly. So although most people usually associate penguins with Antarctica, many penguins, do we say, actually lived or they live along the coast of Africa, Australia, and South Africa or South America? If we look at the word associate, associate is in the present tense. So although most people usually associate penguins with Antarctica, many penguins actually, do we say, lived along the coast of Africa, Australia, and America, or they lived? And in this case, right, associate is in the present tense, which means that we are going to say live. And live is correct. All right, so that is the end of our lesson on inappropriate shifting. And we see that inappropriate shifting is basically when you are using certain wordings within a specific sentence incorrectly. So unless the specific sentence shows that there is going to be a reflect on time change, then we will have two different tenses within one specific sentence. If not, right, it becomes an inappropriate shift. All right. So that is now the end of our lesson on inappropriate shifts in verb tenses. Thank you very much, grade 7s, for joining the class. You should have a good evening further. Goodbye.